it's really important to lead from the top. I need to lead my team through the changes that are inevitably happening. So I actually had Claude help me write a document for the PM team. And then I just posted that. And I said, hey, here it is. Go play with it if you want. Just like be very visibly vulnerable about I don't know what this is. Usually when we ask PMs to do more work, it's drudgery. It's like, hey, go update this ticket, go handle this customer escalation. But this is the most fun thing that I've done in years. And for PMs who are naturally inclined to be builders anyway, it's fun.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the sort of Skip Live series with our coach group. We have a conversation between three terrific execs. We've gotten questions that have been pulled ahead of time. Looks like things are streaming. So I hope everyone's having a good week. This has been a crazy week in the world of PM and AI and technology. There's hiring and tons of companies doing amazing things and layoffs and anxiety across the board. And it's been obviously a difficult start to the year for some of you and an awesome start for others of you. And so my hope is Skip Coach is a service that helps pull you in to what are the latest and greatest things that are, happening in product and how it can assist your career. So I'm joined by three wonderful members, longtime members of my Skip group, which is a group of product executives. All three of them are heads of products, actually. And all three of them have actually are at public companies. And so I'm going to start by doing a quick introduction for everyone. So maybe, Dheerja, I'll start with you. Maybe just give us a little bit of a sense of how long have you been at Hims, what your background was before then, and then kind of what's the state of the product management team. And then we'll do kind of a round robin around that. And then we'll get into the questions that all of you have.
Sounds great. Hey, everyone. Thanks, Nikhil. Excited to be here. I'm also a huge fan of Anneka and Yuhki, so very cool that we're all here together. But yes, I'm Dheerja. I am the CPO at Hims Hers Health. For those of you not familiar, we're a healthcare company that offers access to personalized treatments for chronic conditions, but we also now offer things like diagnostics and lab testing. I've been here 7 months, which feels like 10 weeks and 10 years, depending on the day that you ask me. So it's been quite the ride already. Prior to this, I was at Robinhood, where I was a VP of product there. And I was at Robinhood for about 5 years. So also generally just been in product and tech for my whole career.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I think Dheerja is interesting is that she's inheriting a team of a company that is public, but also sort of saw Robinhood go from early days to much, much more established, also public days. And so the theme and the thrust of today's conversation is, how are those product teams changing, both with the scale of the organization as well as AI? And I think you've got two great experiences to draw from. So, Anneka, tell us a little bit about Rubrik and your experience there.
Yeah, well, great to be here. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Rubrik. Rubrik is a security and AI company now. We focused on cyber recovery and helping organizations make sure they're resilient in case they get breached by a cyber attack. And now we're also working on AI acceleration through providing AI governance to large enterprises. I've been with Rubrik now for coming on 5 years. It's gone by very fast, even though so much has happened. Before Rubrik, I was at a company called LiveRamp in the marketing technology space. It was also a public company, but I was there from the very early days. I think I was employee number 20 before we had product market fit, and was there for quite the journey.
You also oversaw the company and the product organization during the public offering, which was probably about roughly 2 years ago, maybe. Yeah, and Yuhki, you're kind of a year afterwards, if I recall. So tell us a little bit about your Figma experience and kind of what's the current state of the product org.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Excited to be here. Very honored to be speaking alongside a lot of amazing people here. I'm Yuhki, lead the product team here at Figma. Been here for about 7 years now, which by Dheerja's math is probably 40 years. I don't know. And was at Uber before. I would say, it's kind of an interesting time because we're both simultaneously thinking about where the future of product development goes. And how, from our perspective, how to inject more design into that. at the same time, we're ourselves thinking through our own product development process and how to reinvent that. So it's been kind of this fun way to, build a new tool and new experiences, but also learn from our customers too. So yeah, that's been interesting.
That's a really interesting, two sides of the coin. Do you find that a lot of the times that your customers are a little ahead of the way things are being done internally, or is it vice versa? Or does it differ depending on the area of of sort of functionality and kind of discipline?
I've been surprised by how advanced a lot of customers are. And in fact, a lot of what we build is really in service of, their explorations as they think about the future. And, maybe if you're smaller or can try out more new things more boldly, and you're pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and so yeah, that's guided a lot of how we think about, how we contribute to that.
For those of you that are watching live, we have a chat thread open in Substack. So we'd love for you to ask questions and we'll get to them as we go. We did have a chance to hear from a number of you that submitted questions for today's session. And so I'm going to kind of walk through, some of the themes. We had a conversation about a month ago with three AI first companies. These are organizations that are all pre-public. They're also organizations that sort of were constituted with AI as, kind of in its inherent DNA. And so there are younger companies that actually are AI first. The interesting thing about our organizations in this call is that, they've been around for a bit, and yet you have two challenges. One is you're scaling, going public, and then the second is AI has obviously become a huge way of doing product development in the last, 3 years or so. So Amanda Wong asked this question, how has the PM role shifted as your company grew from startup to IPO? How do you avoid slow down processes internally as a product org and the company grew? And so core question for maybe all three of you is just spend a couple minutes just talking through, like, as a company has scaled, you know, we'll talk about AI in a second, but just generally as the company scaled, how has our organization changed? What are things that you had to add or subtract to build product? And maybe, Dheerja, I'll start with you.
I'll probably talk through like similar parallels that I've seen both at Robinhood, at Hims and Hers, even though the scenarios are a little different. I think the first and foremost thing is probably semi-obvious, which is just ownership of the business. I think that there is a distinct difference when you're pre-IPO versus when you're public of the level of accountability on metrics, connection to top line and bottom line, and the expectations of PM. I do think every company does this a little bit differently, but at Robinhood, for example, we actually moved towards a GM model, right? So pretty quickly after IPO. And so even though not all the GMs were, product background, it generally changed the expectations of a PM role to be very, very closely connected to pricing decisions, like P&L ownership, accountability to quarterly metrics, yearly metrics that directly tied to the financials, just by nature of the way the company was organized. That was awesome, I think. I think like the impact, the like morale, the momentum, and of course, just the efficiency of shipping products, like 10x, but it's also different. Like it's a different flavor. And, I would say for the 0 to 1 bets, that was, different. I think, you're operating those a little bit differently. I think the way the PMs were operating were differently, but the biggest shift I saw was definitely that. And I think at Hims and Hers, we are moving in like kind of a similar direction because I do fundamentally believe in it. I think when you're owning products at a public company that are core to the business, like you just can't operate in like here are my product metrics over here, and then there's like some business stuff happening over there. There needs to be this kind of very, very clear direct accountability, direct ownership, and direct visibility of how what you're doing is moving the top line and the bottom line.
Is this just one of those things that you sort of change the objective function for the product organization and then people fall into place? Or did you have to restaff or retrain? Like, how much of this is an inherent skill that is dormant in most product people versus how much of this is like, no, there's a different people that really have more experience with this that we need to go grab?
I will say at Robinhood, we had a really, really strong, and still do, I'm not just not there anymore, PM team that I think rose to the occasion fundamentally. I think what you saw was like the sharp PMs who just like first principles thinkers, like know the metrics, not in addition to kind of like the core product intuition. We're just like, yes, like I can like think even bigger. And so I think we saw a lot of folks, and the majority of folks, that kind of stepped into more of those strategic PM roles, just like rise to the occasion internally. But I also think that, kind of leading up to that, we were also kind of reshaping the PM role kind of like fundamentally to have more of that ownership and strategic thinking and kind of just bar raising. So I think those things coincided. And I do think fundamentally, again, for a PM that owns the core business, whether you're like, actually owning the core product or owning or on a growth team, like I do think the best PMs on those things can have this mentality, especially if they're high growth, they're high horsepower. I do think it's different in like a 0 to 1, strategic bet world. And I think that you can hire for that differently. I think you have like a different set of expectations. But yeah, I don't know. I think that like the strong PMs who are like own core business products, own metrics, growth PMs, like this is in their wheelhouse. They just have to learn some of the mechanics of it.
Hims is a direct to consumer play, in contrast to, Rubrik, which is obviously a more traditional enterprise business to business play, where there is a go to market function, there is absolutely a quarterly target, et cetera. So is accountability something that's shifted as well at Rubrik? And what are kind of the other shifts that you've seen as the company's gone through this maturation?
I saw so many parallels to what Dheerja shared. We also have a product GM model that we have grown into. But if I rewind back 5 years ago, the first shift I had to make on the product team was going from product managers being extremely reactive and just, trying to keep up with what are the customer requests coming in, and a lot of the strategy unclear, like exactly how it was being driven. But there was, strategy coming, but it wasn't being driven from the PMs. And so going from that reactive to proactive, and then at the same time also saying, hey, what we care about is driving the business. And there were specific things that I started to do to help train people up on how to think about this, which was we just started doing product QBRs, and I gave them a template for this is what you've got to do. And the first time around, it was okay, but not great. And just progressively, they got better and better. And we've been doing it for 5 years now, and they're really great sessions. And we just continue to iterate on it. So I think building the ritual of and making it where you're not setting this like incredibly high bar from day one, but you're actually saying, hey, we're gonna go through this together and learn together about what this looks like for this current company and this business and where we're at right now. That's been a great journey.
I think, Yuki, your customer is sort of the third variant, which is, developers, product creators in some ways. And so does the GM model make sense? Is accountability, as Dheerja and Anneka mentioned, shifted beyond kind of where you started? Because you've been at Figma for quite some time now.
I think there's some of what resonates, which is this idea, if I were to generalize it to, you have to think about how your work ladders up to something bigger, right? And, even if you think about OKRs world, KPIs world, like, having that kind of notion of, how you're impacting the top level. But, I think at Figma, how that manifested is also experiential, which is, it's really easy for teams to, at our scale, think they're solving for a use case, but then accidentally complicate the entire system. And so, more and more, we've had to be deliberate about thinking about, okay, the mental model of a user who is not necessarily growing up with Figma, who's maybe not able to grapple with all that complexity. And so the systems thinkers, who are thinking about how things fit together, the people who are simplifying as you're adding more, those are the skill sets that we've needed more and more. And that kind of intention is important, especially in a world where we're still trying to move incredibly fast and, trying to solve all these user needs.
Yeah, I love that point. Essentially, what I'm hearing from you is as Figma has become more feature rich and as the customer base has become a large established, group, it's not so easy to make change because change disrupts, change creates complexity. And so, in some ways, the craft of understanding the system and the user and being able to add while not subtracting, reminds me a little bit when I was at Meta and there was all these new features that you would add to, say, Facebook, but it would just move people from one part of the app to another. And so the system thinkers had to really think about incrementality. Like, is this really a net new thing, or is this just a change that's sort of adding negativity? But it wouldn't exist when the company was early. And the challenge, I guess, is that that creates like slowdown. Founder led companies tend to be like, oh, how come we're not moving at the same pace? And I'm sure all three of you, which are all happen to be in very founder led, very kind of well known folks who have been driving a lot of pace of innovation. And now AI is coming in, which is like kind of rocket fuel to sort of expectations around how come we're not moving quickly. But, Yuki, at the same time, you've got this sort of much more carefully crafted system. In Rubrik's case, you've got many customers that are now mission critical. Breaking things is a huge issue. So how, maybe pivoting to this question, I'll start with you, Yuki, like how do you, reconcile the changes that product management needs to do from an AI perspective and maybe the speed expectations with more to protect?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is designing both your product and your strategy in a way where, as an example, we have new surfaces that allow us to be more experimental, right? And there's a lot of things that are still unreconciled on our platform today, but it's okay because we're learning more and we're going to refactor the system and just being intentional about that. So, as an example, we have Figma Make, our product for, turning a prompt into an app. And there are ways in which we would like it to be more reconciled with Figma Make, and we're working to our Figma design, and we're working towards that. But all the learnings that we're getting along the way is totally worth what may be still an imperfect system in users' eyes. And so that's kind of one way to make sure that you're not kind of in this mode of I remember when I used to work at Windows and Microsoft, one of the kind of principles was change is bad unless it's great. And while, I think it is a good principle, we don't want to also accidentally kind of like, discourage change either, right?
Yeah, Anneka, what's your relationship with change and expectations, particularly with AI, where everyone's like, can't I just vibe code that today on Friday and make it work on Monday?
So I think it's a huge opportunity for us. So yes, in an enterprise B2B context where we're working with traditional enterprises, think financial services, healthcare, places where the stakes are very high and the desire to change quickly is low, there is still an incredible opportunity. We get so many bugs logged by customers that take an incredible amount of time because our platform is so broad and we have so much going on across on-prem, cloud, SaaS. Like it's a very, very complex and technical product that being able, like an engineer to be able to actually diagnose a bug faster and resolve it faster leads to an incredible positive outcome for customer experience. Also, we have like a whole bunch of small asks, requests for enhancements that our customers want. If we can actually take like if a large bank comes to us and says, hey, this report that you have in the UI isn't really meeting my needs, can you just like add this one field? Typically that would take us like 2 weeks to go do. If we can actually do that in a few days, like think about like how delightful that is that we're able to solve that problem for them. So I feel like and there's a lot of other stuff like when we're thinking about complex new features, especially like really net new things, what we're finding is that AI in the hands of engineering allows them to much more quickly come up with a solution. So things that we thought were like, oh, we're not even going to get to the like to talking about this for a couple of quarters because like we don't have an even idea of what the design or concept for how we would solve this problem really looks like. Well, now we're able to go do that a lot faster and we're able to pull those things in. So I think there is a way to manage like how much change can your customer take with also like figuring out the strategic places to accelerate. And I've like never been more excited about what the art of the possible is in terms of what we can do with our product and our portfolio because of the acceleration of AI.
A lot of the conversation at the board levels is, hey, this AI thing has a ton of promise and it builds on your note of these areas are all very lucrative, but there's an ask that now boards are saying is, can you quantify? Are you actually showing features that are going out the door where fewer engineers are involved, faster delivery before? Do you feel like we're at a stage now, February 2026, we're able to say, yes, yes, we can quantify direct impact that AI has had in our delivery?
Not quite yet for us. Like, I think we know what metrics we're looking at for engineering. We're looking at diff counts. And we know that overall, what we need to be thinking about in the longer term is revenue per FTE, and how is overall like revenue per FTE going way up. But we haven't manifested material changes there yet. But I think this is the year.
And is that a artifact of the state of the technology or the maturity of the organization?
I think it is just our ability to adopt the technology at this stage. But I wouldn't have said that six months ago. I think it wasn't possible for a code base of our complexity to be able to do what we can do without the latest models, without Opus and Sonnet and all of those things. Now, for our complexity of code base, the productivity gains are actually very, very real.
And Dheerja, you find yourself in an unusual position where you joined in the past year. So you joined with, I think, an expectation that you were going to be an AI queen. You were going to change, Hims to be an AI first company. And I think that all three of you had to do some level of change, but coming in from the outside versus having tenure where all of the staff needs to potentially be retrained or taught or different objectives, that is a very, very different challenge. I'm curious as to what's your thinking around how are you introducing AI and how do you iterate your way through these cultural changes?
Yeah. But first of all, AI queen, love that. Definitely don't live up to that expectation.
You should put that on your LinkedIn.
Yeah, right. Nikhil said. Okay, so there are three components of this. So the first is I do think that there's a distinct difference, and hopefully all companies will end up in this place. But I think there's a distinct difference between the companies where there is just an obvious step change impact to the business and the product with AI, to the actual product, not the internal processes, not the tools, not the productivity, but it is just a core part of how the company is going to move forward. Again, I think all companies are going to get there, but part of why I joined Hims and Hers is that I think we probably all feel this. Health questions and kind of healthcare in general is probably one of the single best use case for AI. There's a doctor shortage. The quality of the care is terrible. I can go on and on about the healthcare system. And so actually, I think the first thing that we've been focused on more so than, spreading adoption and internal productivity and all of that is how do we actually build consumer grade products that have in healthcare that have AI at its core, because it's a massive unlock for the business and for the customer experience. And I've loved that because it creates a little bit of a waterfall effect and forcing function, because AI is just the core product that we're actually building. So I think that's one thing that is probably obvious, but I do think that when you actually look around, that varies quite a bit industry to industry and company to company. There are a lot of companies that are oh shit, what's our AI feature going to be? And so that's one thing that I honestly will just say we've been laser focused on. So that's one. I think the second is, throughput and velocity of production code. Essentially, I think that's a lot of what Anneka is touching on. And I think we've definitely seen, I agree with Anneka, a step change even in just the last 6 months. And I think you're seeing, for example, we were able to build 0 to 1 product on getting 100 plus biomarkers tested, processing those results, building treatment recommendations on that and delivering them to you in a few months. And I think that was hard. That was a 0 to 1 production grade product, that scale. And then the third component is, especially when you're talking about PM and kind of this role, the speed of decision making by just having tangible things to look at, right? We talk a lot about, I think one of the earliest use cases for PM was prototyping, your vibe coding, et cetera. I do think that you're starting to see teams build as you make decisions because suddenly, the impetus on doing all the upfront thinking and all of the conversations and looking at Figmas and, all of that, it just aren't as necessary as just starting to build and ship and quickly pivoting as you're feeling a product, especially a consumer product in your hands. And I think all those three things are connected, but those are the three components that I'm at least seeing.
I love that. I want to go back to a question that we asked initially around kind of how does the stage of company affect sort of PM. Farshad asked a question on the live chat, which is when referring to startups, it's a big range from an early stage startup to a late stage unicorn. I'm curious if IPO, specifically the public offering date, is an explicit line or transformation starts a couple of years before IPO. How do you think about a PM leader navigating that? So my specific area of focus on this question is both Yuki and Anneka, you oversaw the product teams before and after the actual public offering. And what I'm curious around is, was it a was it just another day where it was a celebration, it was back to work? Or did you literally have to change something in the product organization, function, way of working because of the concept of being public and the changes that exist, whether that's on the day of or shortly before, shortly after? Did the actual public offering change the sort of sense of working and the product offering? So maybe Yuki, I'll start with you because you're the most recent IPO.
Well, I think what's interesting is the expectation from everyone that it will change, and that includes employees, but also our customers, right? What will Figma be like as a public company? And because of that, I think we are more conscious of making sure that we're not showing up differently, right? As an example, we've always been a company that's responsive to customer feedback and engaging with the community. There might be a perception that as a public company we'll do that less. And so we have to kind of overcorrect for that in some ways. And so that's kind of like one interesting thing that, I've come to realize in terms of how the perception plays into it to some extent. And then the other thing is just kind of like, I don't think anything about, there wasn't a day where we're like, hey, we're a public company, therefore we're going to like behave differently necessarily. Obviously, there are some like basic things you have to know. But I think that, the clarity of strategy, the clarity of our narrative has to be sharpened a little bit more. There are moments and times like earnings calls where, we want to be able to kind of communicate more externally our strategy or clarify it and being on the same page around it, keeping it up to date. Those are forcing functions. Whereas maybe as a private company, you'd have to orchestrate that yourself.
All three of you, maybe this is sort of an elephant in the room question, but all three of you have also overseen the company as the stocks fluctuated. And, as of this recording and this call, the market's really down. And, all three of your stocks are substantially below their all-time high, which was relatively recent. And so what I'm curious around is, how do product managers kind of work through that? What are things that you've either had to sort of adapt, or what cultural shifts have you had to do to manage, just stock fluctuation, thinking long term, et cetera? I'll leave this one open for anyone that wants to jump on this one.
I think our last earnings call was in December and the stock went way up right after the earnings call. And then if you look at the stock today, it's way down from that moment in time. And what the key message that we have been trying to give to everyone is, first of all, there's things that we can control in the market. There's things we can't control in the market. Control the things that we can control. Like, we've got to execute exceptionally well. We've got to keep doing what we're doing and do it even better every single day. And the markets are going to go up and down as they are. We have announced literally nothing of any magnitude since our last earnings call. So all this fluctuation is really based on market perception. If we execute well and if we do our job right and if we execute on AI transformation, which is our big theme for the year, then like we will be in a great place. And so just trying to reassure people, because a lot of folks, what I find is like they just don't have this understanding of how the markets work. And so you have to teach them and you have to help them understand and give them confidence that yes, like, this is reality, and we're like very soon going to be going through our comp planning. So we'll have to figure out what that means from an equity perspective. But, all will be well is essentially what we tell people. But like we have to continue to execute really, really well.
I mean, in some ways, I can imagine there's also some safety in numbers. I mean, it's one thing if one stock is being targeted, and another thing if all of the market is particularly down. It's not that you can sort of point at one thing, but I know that's a tough one. I want to transition to talent for a second, because I think one of the other sides of the coin is, hey, here's how we operate, how we build products, and how we make decisions, and how things have been structured. And the other is just who is in our staff and how do we identify or encourage, AI native. Anneka, you made this note that, this is a year of AI transformation, right? So that's going to require a different way of doing product. Dheerja, you mentioned that, hey, now we have products being, built using AI out the door. Yuhki has Figma Make, which is obviously a very product designed to help people that are doing, this AI transformation. You know, Rich just asked this question, there's a push for AI native PMs. Meta is re-interviewing PM for AI native skills, second brain, vibe coding, evals. How do you think of an AI native PM? Just to give background, it was sort of leaked that potentially Meta is not only building a new archetype for interviewing talent, based on a set of skills that are AI native, but perhaps even looking at existing staff to encourage, everyone should move to this level. So this kind of falls into the, not only are we seeing transformation based on the success and growth of the company and public offering, we're also just building products differently. But the same people are in the company that were before this transformation. And everyone's just crazy busy. I mean, that's the part that no one wants to talk about is, you hear on, you see it on X where everyone's on Claude Code and using OpenClaw and building their, favorite agent. I think Anneka was building an agent this morning, it sounds like. But like not all of us have the skill, the time, the energy, the ability to kind of do that. So how do you test and measure and encourage this? I want to ask all three of you this question. Maybe Dheerja, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, it's tough. I don't think I have the perfect answer on this, I will say. But I do think that at a macro level, um, the PM role not having enough time to do like forward thinking, like kind of like investing in the future of like whether it's their like strategy and roadmap or whether it's like investing in how they like get unlocks with AI is like a tale as old as time. Right? Like we've all like it's a tough job. Like it is a hard job. You were working so hard and there's always a long list and you never get to the end of that list and there's always demands of you. And so I think like one mentality I actually have is that, like this is something I think every PM leader talks about and fields questions from their ICs all the time when they get career feedback around, I don't have time for strategy, and I think it's actually like a similar thing, which is that, one, you're, very simply and very bluntly, like, you just like it's a massive unlock. It is an investment in your future growth, but also like will be a massive unlock for the short term. And like you're probably doing a bunch of things that are just not that important. Like fundamentally, and so I think there's just a little bit of that kind of orientation that's really important. And then second is, yeah, I think that there's this like, I've definitely heard and felt this sentiment that to learn this stuff, it has to be extracurricular, and I think like you have to find time in the weekend, you have to like vibe code in the mornings. And I think that's really hard. Like, I have a young kid, it's tough. And so I think as leaders, you actually have to, carve out and like almost in some examples, almost be a little bit prescriptive and set up the expectations that, hey, what I've tried to do, for example, is, there's like these set of initiatives and these set of like projects. We're going to tackle this differently. And like, here's what I want you to do. And actually like give them the space to do that. And it might be overly prescriptive, but I think that forcing function top down makes a huge difference, and you're not going to be able to do it everywhere, but starting to build those proof points in the organization, I think at least has been the most beneficial.
Yuhki, as you staffed your team to do these AI first products, are you looking for folks that have done a lot of AI in the past who are perhaps familiar with large language models or vibe code, as experts or half engineer, half product people? Or are you more focused on first principles thinking and trying to get just a different, like what Dheerja described, of like, hey, this is a different way of building, but we're not looking to sort of wholesale look for a different skill set?
I think that initially we started with a seed of people who have done it before, who know the techniques, who can fast forward, through some of kind of, best practices, learnings from the past. And that was important. We brought in a leader who's done that before, and so the first seed of PMs, I think, especially for our AI products, were that. But it was quickly important to also augment that with people who don't come from those backgrounds for two reasons. One is like maybe having different points of view and being able to come at it from first principles, but also, to prove to the organization that this isn't, like everyone can do this and can learn, right? And especially when it relates to the way you work, I actually think that a lot of these tools aren't really hard skills. These tools are becoming easier and easier and easier, and these tools are, you can kind of ask for help from the tool and the tool will help you too, right? And I think about kind of the past when, I tried to, many years ago when I first started Figma, try to pull down the code base and like get my setup. And like I was step 7 of 20 and I just got stuck and I was kind of embarrassed to reach out to an engineer to get me to help. And now it's kind of like, oh, like let me, like get help debugging that, right? And so I think that's where more and more increasingly I'm feeling that it's about the mentality. And of course, to Dheerja's point, like the bandwidth and time and space rather than like a necessarily kind of like a skill that you have or don't have.
Let me build on that last point. Like, I think both you and Deirdre are making a note that this can't be a side hustle. This needs to be part of the core job. But like all of us know that the people that are in our team spend most of their day in meetings because a lot of the job is connecting the dots and making things kind of work across different functions. So maybe Anneka, how have you been able to create space or retrain, or sort of encourage people to sort of get more engaged in these tools, even to ask for help, et cetera? Like how do you do that and then balance the needs of, you have a team that's international, right? So you have late calls and all. I mean, I can't imagine how you create the space for this type of work.
So it's very early days. I don't have all the answers to this by any means because I'm just trying things. So I think first, it's really important to lead from the top and to really like, I feel like my number one job is to become an expert in what is the art of the possible because I need to lead my team through the changes that are inevitably happening. And the more that I can be an expert, the more I can help them and figure it out because it will be all of us figuring it out together. And so my approach so far has been like, be very visible about here's what I'm doing. I'm trying this. And I actually wrote a guide because all the engineering docs for setting up Claude Code were just like, I mean, I've used the command line before. I've been an engineer before, so at least I have some familiarity. But I thought it was not super accessible. So I actually had Claude help me write a document for the PM team so that anyone who wants to get going, they have like an easier entry point. And then I just posted that and I said, hey, here it is. I've gotten you guys all access to our GitHub repos. So go play with it if you want. And then some people engage. And then I help them. I help them troubleshoot. I'm personally helping them troubleshoot. I'm like, oh, go ask this to Claude, or like, I had the same issue. Here's what you can do. And just like be very visibly vulnerable about like, I don't know what this is, but also like show people. And like the next step is like, I'm building an agent for the team to help with triaging the requests for enhancements. And it's been really fun to play with that over the past week. And I just do it between meetings. It's easy to just like write a natural language thing to Claude and it'll go do stuff. And then I approve things and it keeps going and we just iterate together. And so, but like I'm going to go demo that to the team and show them like this is something that I've built. And I think the nice thing about this is that usually when we ask PMs to do more work, it's drudgery. It's like, hey, go update this ticket, go like handle this customer escalation. But this is like the most fun thing that I've done in years. And for PMs who are naturally inclined to be builders anyway, it's fun. Like I make time in the day. I have a small child. Like I don't have a lot of, time. I don't think of it as a side thing. I'm like, this is my job. This is my number one job right now is to figure this out because like, how am I going to be a leader for this function if I'm not? And that's the mentality I take. And I'm letting other things drop. Like I missed an important email, which never happens to me this week because I was like busy vibe coding my agent. And it was a little embarrassing, but I was like, oh my God, like I've dropped the ball. But it's okay. It's like the trade-off that I'm willing to make.
I think that someone was telling me this story where they were like, the dream of every product manager is to vibe code all day long. And I actually think that, and we've talked about like what it means to sort of prioritize things that are important. I think the faster that they find joy and is the distance to unlock. So the moment that they start like, oh, I can do this, is the moment that the team starts really, really believing and making time, if you will, because it's is very different than the QBR that they have to sort of adhere to that, is drudgery.
I think that if you talk to PMs too, like a lot of the muck and the least fun of the job is when you're just like trying to coordinate different functions to do their job. It's like, okay, like I've like written this thing. Okay, now I need like marketing to put together like positioning. Okay, I've like written this thing and now I need to like jam with like design on this thing. And like the all of that is like fundamentally changing. And so I think when you ask the question about like how do you help top down, I also think it's spending a lot of time in those functions to set the PMs up to be able to cross those boundaries without getting hit with like roadblocks and meetings every step of the way. Like everybody's got to hold hands on that. Like, it is okay for PMs and designers and engineers and marketers to blur the lines, And I think when you don't do that at bigger companies that haven't fully understood or adopted this, like everybody's operating with a different set of expectations. And so I think that's like one thing that we can do to help top down.
Yeah, the other big narrative right now that I think you hear from a lot of the AI first companies, particularly, and even the larger frontier labs like Anthropic and OpenAI, is that there's a bit of an allergic reaction to managers who are product managers. Like the boldface has moved from the second word to the first word in that function's name. That everyone needs to be in the detail, everyone needs to be very opinionated, they need less supervision, teams are flat. And so many of the heads of products are the first manager in the product organization when they join. And, they just don't have a hierarchy. Having said that, obviously there's the late stage companies that have, thousands of folks and, it's not practical for them to have, very, very sparse trees. But in your case, all three of you, do have sizable product organizations and quite a bit to protect. So how have you thought about the role of a manager in your product team? And in particular, how has that shifted in the last couple of years? Because I think we see that now there's a lot more efficiency and a lot perhaps less need for coordination using some of these tools and more agency on behalf of the different functions. So do you have a different org structure picture in your head than maybe you would have held 2 years back? And are you recruiting different types of managers?
The first reaction I had was actually that I think everyone's going to become a manager in a sense. You're a manager of agents. And so those skills are actually really important because you're reviewing work, you're kind of making decisions based on work that's coming back and like farming it out. And so that's just kind of one observation. But to answer your question, I would say that, at least at Figma, we've always had this perspective. And I think in PM org specifically, you see this more in a lot of companies I've worked at, which is that there's always kind of like an IC component to your work. Like every manager at every level is actually IC PMing in some capacity and staying close to the details. And I think because we've had that in our culture, what this this AI tooling, all these things enable is for people to just do more, right? And so I don't think, at least in my org, we have any pure people managers as an example. And that's almost by design. And that's maybe what makes it feel a little bit more, I don't know if flat is exactly the word, but it feels like you're not having to work through a lot of abstractions to get stuff done.
Yeah, a huge plus one to that. I think that every single person in the org is a builder and is accountable to actually delivering something, regardless of what level you are. And I think what that inherently means is that you have folks who, are there. There's no such thing as somebody whose entire job is management. Like that's just not a thing anymore.
I agree with all of this. One thing I will add is like one of the ways that I have already been involving the org over the past few years is that my direct reports are essentially the GMs. And so they are in charge of like the overall commercial success of their product lines. And that requires a lot of going into the details with sales now on are we doing enough pipeline generation? What's going on by country and region? It's way more than just the product strategy, which also means that as we've transitioned into this and they're doing a lot more commercially to connect the dots together and make sure we're on the right track, that some of the product strategy work has to be picked up by the directors under them. So then like the first line management layer, and we're pretty flat. We don't have a lot of layers in there. So I got to think of like the directors / first line managers. They are really having to step up more around the product strategy, and still the GMs are developing the strategy, but they have to be able to take the ball from on ideas and be able to push that further. And then the ICs on the team are, again, like everyone's got to have the builder mindset, and the amount of work that's actually going to be there for the team in the coming year is going to be drastically more because engineering is no longer the bottleneck. And so the work of everyone is actually going way up. And so we have to figure out like, how do you delegate more down while obviously still staying like very close to the details?
all three of you have organizations that are sizable product organizations that are growing. My expectation is they will be larger this time next year than they are today. You will be hiring from the outside. The companies that all three of you work at are highly, highly desirable. A ton of people watching or listening to this would be very excited to be part of those companies or interview for the companies, et cetera. We've talked a little bit about what the responsibilities and how the organization works, how products get built, but we haven't spent as much time talking about like core skills. Like if you're looking for a generalist, what are the things that you and your team suss out in the interview process that make them quite successful in your organization? And particularly in the age of AI, particularly as more and more are questions that can be answered by tooling, what's your process like for identifying talent?
I wouldn't say we have it completely perfectly, but one of the things I really care about right now is this feeling of resourcefulness, right? That, this feeling of, if people have at least the mentality that they can unblock themselves, they can in fact unblock themselves. And so then you think about how do you actually interview for that? And it can be hard, right? We, for example, have a component that's a take home, right? Assignment of sorts or a presentation. And that's where people have a stage to demonstrate that. And it's not that we ask people to go and be resourceful, we just have a pretty basic prompt. But I think the way people show up for it really differentiates one candidate from another, right? Maybe in the past, someone would just build a basic deck of like, here's my ideas and what to do. And maybe kind of like in today's world, people are making prototypes. Maybe in a future world, they've already, built some things and done some testing or gotten. And so I think like all that is now possible. And it's just really interesting to kind of give people a blank canvas and see what they do.
The sort of take homes, one of the bigger parts of more and more companies are using take homes.
I don't know about that, but I've been a strong proponent of it just because with other functions, there's actually this very clear deliverable that kind of gets reviewed. Like you're both pair programming or something, or, you're looking at these designs. And with PMs, it's like, what is our deliverable to some extent, right? Like we're just kind of like always going for impact, right? And it can take so many different forms and like maybe the artifacts matter way less. And so as a result of that, like the more we can get closer to, to get a sense of how they work, right? The better, because otherwise you just end up in like, people who can speak really well or people who can whiteboard really well. And those are important skills to be sure. But, I think kind of proximity to the work or being able to visualize how they would actually work is really important. And I think the homework does a really good job of that for me, at least.
Dheerja, in your process, do you end up having a kind of a take home and does it help suss out kind of these core skills that you're looking for?
We don't do a take home, and we didn't do it at Robinhood either. Definitely have gone back and forth on it. I think there's often just like that tension of, time commitment and then, how much do you get from that versus on the spot, and I'm sure that I think that's been debated like endlessly. And to Yuki's point, there is no perfect answer. I do love what you're saying, though, Yuki. I think in this day and age now, there's actually more value to the take home based on a lot of it you're describing. That's very cool. Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe this is like a little bit of a basic answer, but I think that there's a lot of people who know how to like talk the talk and have read all the stuff about PM case studies and things like that. I think the more you can get really, really deep into like the substance of their decision making and judgment and how they have made trade-offs, like that is still the fundamental, and like, how they approach things first principles, but like really like let's get into the weeds on like specific things that you have done and made decisions on it. Like my favorite interview to do is like an hour long, like single project, single product, like walk me through. They're walking me through like every day of decision making essentially, and I'm like pushing them. And like it's very easy to suss out when somebody maybe actually didn't own the thing or like, doesn't really understand like the how to think about decisions and trade-offs as you're like actually building a product. And that's just like, I think, again, a very like classic thing. But I think really going deep on that stuff versus like your, high level case studies, your, just like behavioral stuff like that, that stuff can be really fluffy.
The last session that we did on for coach, the actual group was folks that had recently gotten jobs, and they made a comment that when they were interviewing, there was a shift, not just for take home, as Yuki mentioned, but actually shift towards more scenario, like new scenario develop, like positioning as opposed to past. So they were like, it had less to do with what we'd done in the past, more to do with how they would react to this brand new scenario. So I'm curious, as you think about, your process, take home, past versus like a, or, kind of a new scenario, and then the skills you're looking for, like how are you reconciling, the sort of process of identifying talent?
Yeah, I can quickly answer that. I do think you need both. I've had a little I think without a take home, I do think it's hard to get into depth in scenarios. And like I think it takes a really good interview interviewer to do that. Because and I think, like, sussing out what I was describing around, like, judgment and decision making, like, I'm talking about, like, on the ground judgment decision, not, like, strategy, not, like, 0 to 1, here's how I would, like, theoretically approach this problem. I'm talking, like, you were in the the nitty-gritty of this, you were facing these, like, 4 decision points, like, how did you work through that? And if you can do that with an interviewer who can, like, actually build the depth on their example while you're going, you can get a lot out of that, and I think that's actually and I do think that, separate from that, throwing curveballs, scenarios that they haven't thought of. I think Yuki's example of the take home or figuring out how to do a forward looking thing is really helpful. I just haven't really found that to be as useful on like judgment and decision making as it is core product thinking.
So I'm really anti take home. And maybe it's because I've just never been able to do it well. I'm fully open to that. But I'm pretty anti take home. I just feel like it isn't high signal enough. And now with AI, like people can just do a lot. And I like Yuki's idea of like, hey, maybe they actually even go build something. One of the things that I think about is like and also I just plus one to what Dheerja is saying is like about just going really deep on the decisions they've made in the past, the challenges they've been made in the past, and really understanding how they think about and approach problem solving. But going forward, crazy idea that I haven't thought that much about is like actually just having people like in the interview process live working through Claude Code together to build something. And it doesn't even have to be like something amazing because like really what I want to see is that people are system thinkers. They can break down problems into pieces because when you think about this world of iteration that Dheerja brought up earlier in the conversation of like you can just iterate so quickly, it's like that's probably the best way to go is like you start small and you just keep iterating and adding more and more stuff. And so can you break down problems into the right like, kind of micro tasks to go do? And then also can you like ask good questions? Because anything that you want to ask, like as long as you ask the right question, AI can answer your question for you. And so I do wonder if there's like some just like there's live pair programming that engineers do, like whether the interview processes move in the direction of like even for PMs, there's actually a live component so you can see how people think about and react to a real situation in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway from this discussion is going to be the systems thinking is sort of inherent at the scale and with the tools that we have, and that's where we look for talent, and that's what the job increasingly requires. And increased responsibility and accountability is obviously a parallel to that because there's a lot more to protect. And this curiosity, grit, resourcefulness, these three things kind of deeply characterize the stage of company and the product staff. As we close out, maybe I'll give it, last word for all three of you. Think a little bit about what the conversation will be like in a year from now. Is there anything that we take for granted today that will change? Is there anything new that you expect, both in terms of, could be in terms of the talent that you identify, it could be the way that you build product, it could be even, and especially in Yuki's case, like how products are being even developed externally in our industry. I'm just curious as to what your clairvoyant mind sort of says, in the sort of 12-month going forward look.
I think we're all thinking because, the landscape is moving so fast that, and I was thinking about the fact that, at Figma, we deprecated annual planning. So 12 months from now is a year from now, But yeah, I mean, I can start. I mean, I think that like, we're kind of going through this transition where maybe last year, right, there's a lot of performative AI going on where there's these kind of cool demos and you were kind of curious if it really made a difference and you weren't sure. And especially if you're too busy, right, to explore that deeply or show up in a curious way, you kind of let it pass and, you're kind of like, I'll see how it plays out, right? And I think now we're kind of in this phase where we're starting to realize that even the way we work can be reinvented. And it turns out that PMs are really great at thinking about, if we can approach redesigning our process like we do our job, right? Then I think real productivity gets unlocked. And so, I just wonder if that shift is going to happen more and more, where people are going to own the process and culture in a way that they own the product. And that's going to be even more important, right? And to everyone's point today, that's not just kind of like an extracurricular, like oftentimes there will be an extracurricular of like, let's write new interview questions or let's redefine the career ladder. And like, those are important, but like, it's always considered a side thing. And maybe this just becomes like, a core part of how we work as well, where, you're constantly refactoring the way you work. And that's just as impactful as, the product work that you're doing.
I think fundamentally it's going to be the best time in the world to be a PM. Like, truly believe that. Like we all said, building is the best part of the job and you'll get to do more of it. I also think that fundamentally just everything will ultimately shift towards like being reviewers and making decisions versus actually doing work, and like that'll be awesome. But it's going to be such a big shift. You just think about even the evolution of PM from like execution of essentially like engineering and design work, right? To like that. It's very cool.
Anneka, are you equally optimistic?
I'm equally optimistic. I'm a huge believer, and I think just the whole product development life cycle, the whole roles of what does engineering, product design do, how do they work together? We're all figuring this out right now, but I think in a year from now, we'll actually have some established paradigms of how this all changes, and it is going to be a radical change. That's what I believe in how we all work and how our workflows go. And it's in such an exciting time because, as Yuhki said, we get to design if we get to design the process now and we get to be part of this change. And in 5 years, like all these things will be figured out for us. So it's never been a more exciting time to be a PM, as Dheerja said. And also, it's never been a more exciting time to be a leader of an organization.
On that note, thank all three of you for a terrific session. I learned a ton. I think it was great and helpful to hear about what it's like to work at this stage of company, which is, it sounds like it's one of the most interesting phases of company as well, particularly given, both innovating and scaling at the same time. Hopefully we'll get a chance to re-meet in 1 year and hear about how equally exciting and amazing the past year has been as all of these tools and our organizations get smarter and quicker. Thanks all of you for joining that are live, as well as the people that joined ahead of time that submitted questions. And we'll see you next time in a couple weeks. I'm Nikhil. Thanks, Dheerja. Thanks, Anneka. And thanks, Yuhki. Bye, everyone.